Thank you for watching this week's episode. Today's episode is the second video in a three-part series that covers the topic of the growing problem of child sex trafficking in the US. If you have not watched the first video, I recommend you watch the first and then finish this video afterward, because that video covers the scope of the problem. And in today's episode, I will shed light on who the victims are and who is at the greatest risk to be victimized. And the episode will end with a real-life story of a girl who was trafficked for sex by her own father for more than a decade. Tomorrow's video will finish the three-part series by pointing out who is victimizing these kids by purchasing them for sex. Now, on with the episode. In the first episode, I covered how big the problem of child sex trafficking has become. But just to be sure we're on the same page, let the statistics sink in. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received 8.2 million reports in 2016 alone. Many of the reports were related to child sexual abuse images, and there were also cases of online enticement, child molestation, and child sex trafficking. And all of this took place in the US. To better understand who these victims are, we need to look at who has been rescued in the past. In 2016, a study commissioned by the Department of Justice titled Youth Involvement in the Sex Trade found that boys may make up around 36% of children caught up in the US sex industry, while about 60% are female and less than 5% are transgender. Another group of researchers found similar results in 2008 when researchers from the John Jay School of Criminal Justice reported that boys account for about 45% of child sex trafficking victims in New York City. There is definitely an underreporting of males involved in sex trafficking, and the result is that tens of thousands of boys and men continue to suffer in silence. And like other victims of sexual abuse, they are at a greater risk of depression, suicide, and more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, and more likely to be incarcerated. Importantly, I want to make sure to say that these numbers are dependent upon identified victims and estimated calculations. In the Global Report on Trafficking from 2018, of identified victims, males made up only 6% of those trafficked for sex, with young boys making up the majority of victims. And while these numbers are vastly different, the important thing to note here is that the boys are absolutely sex trafficked within the US, and we need to know and acknowledge this if we will ever be able to stop it. Understanding that males are involved in this horrific crime against children is only one step. We need to look further at the demographic that is really being targeted here. And no, I'm not talking about girls. Kids who are homeless are some of the most at-risk kids in the country. A series of recent studies done by Covenant House, Fordham University, and Loyola University interviewed homeless youth across 13 cities and found that 19.4% were victims of human trafficking. That means 1 out of every 5 homeless youths involved in those studies was a victim of rape, and likely this happened many times. The data shows clearly that being homeless is a huge risk factor for being trafficked for sex as a minor. But did you know that there is also a big racial disparity in who is trafficked? According to the FBI, 52% of all minors that were arrested for commercial sex acts were African American, and over 91% of girls participating in the Los Angeles Star Court are African American or Latino. The Star Court is a court set up to deal with human trafficking cases only. To appreciate the increased amount of risk that these youth are under, consider that African Americans comprise around 17% of the national population. This means they are being overrepresented at more than 250% of what we would find if risk was evenly spread out. Other factors that have been identified in those who are trafficked is age and foster care. I've covered both of these in separate videos, but wanted to mention here again. The range of youth entering into sex trafficking on average is somewhere between 13 to 15 years old. Sadly though, as the story I'm about to share with you shows, kids as young as 1 year old can be trafficked for sex. If you would like to understand the connection that the foster care system has to child sex trafficking, I strongly recommend you check out this previous video I made that discusses the pipeline of kids being trafficked while they are in the foster care system. So after looking at the data, I think now we have a sense of who is at the greatest risk for child sex trafficking in the US. We know that this can happen to anyone because even boys make up a sizable portion of those who are victimized. We know that being homeless increases a youth's chances of being sexually exploited exponentially. And many homeless youth who are victimized will find themselves engaging in survival sex, where they exchange sex for shelter or food. We have also discovered that trafficking affects youth disproportionately based on race, with African American youth being more likely than most other races to be trafficked for sex as a minor. And we briefly touched on the average age for this horrible crime starting in the early teen years. Now, I want to share a story with you that shows how trafficking children for sex is usually committed through coercion and a majority of the time by someone the youth knows and trusts. Kelly was born into a home where her father had a grudge against women. This grudge had him physically abuse Kelly's mom, and just as Kelly turned 1, he started to abuse her physically and sexually too. Over time, he allowed his acquaintances to abuse her as well. He made sure that Kelly knew that these encounters were their secret. To cover his tracks, he used grooming techniques, telling her this was a way to show him her love, that it was something all little girls did. As a young girl, no one knew the suffering Kelly was going through. She went to school, got good grades, and excelled at sports. Incredibly, Kelly did share with some adults what was happening to her, but no one intervened. So her victimization continued as her father trafficked her out to more and more men while raping his own daughter for years. Finally, at 13, Kelly found herself in a middle school health class that would begin her journey out of the abuse that she had been living with for more than a decade. Up to that point, Kelly assumed all of her friends were doing things like this at home and they just didn't talk about it. However, as the teacher led a discussion about incest, rape, and abuse, that idea began to unravel. She saw her classmates say how disgusted they were at the very thought of incest. In that moment, Kelly realized she was all alone with her secret. Her experience was not normal and definitely not the experience of her friends. Immediately, she felt ashamed. But 2 years after the health class, at just 15 years old, she spoke out, went to court, and testified against her biological father. The state brought 27 counts against him, and he pled guilty to 19. But he did not have to pay restitution to Kelly or register as a sex offender. He served only 2 months in prison for crimes that spanned 13 years, from Kelly's first birthday to the time she was 14 years old. This is not quite the happy ending we wanted, but at least Kelly is no longer suffering. Unfortunately for a lot of kids, this is as good as it gets, as many traffickers never face the full amount of justice they deserve. But the more we know about this crime, the more we can do to help kids like Kelly break free. That is all for this week's episode, but make sure you click the subscribe button because this 3-part series continues tomorrow with another episode and a look at who is purchasing sex with minors in the US. Tomorrow's episode will conclude with another survivor story and deeper insight into this growing problem. Thanks for watching.